Today is Wednesday, 23rd March 2022, and we are opening a session of Ontology Summit 2022, and the topic of today's talk is risks. It's a very interesting topic, pretty close to my liking because I have worked as a risk analyst for 1 year of my life. But it is a great pleasure today to invite and see our chair of the board of Ontolog Forum, Mr. Dr. Ken Baclawski, who has an illustrious career, not only in academics of math and science and engineering, but also in terms of being associated with this forum for nearly 20 years or something like that. So we can look at the page of his bio and get more information from it. Suffice it to say that I know that he knows many, many disciplines of studies. And it is a great pleasure for me, Ravi Sharma, to welcome Dr. Ken Baclawski to speak to us about risks today. Thank you. And recording is in progress.
Yes. Thank you, Ravi. So you might wonder why risk? What's the significance within this summit? Well, risk and disasters, as you might imagine, are related. We have to be concerned about the risk of a disaster occurring, the risks to the individuals when a disaster is occurring. There are different levels, of disaster. And so it seems reasonable that any treatment, any vocabulary or ontology of disaster should include risks. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. Try to have some interesting discussion about this notion, bring in some different points of view. Because the fact is there are many notions of risk, and you can miscommunicate if you have different interpretations of risk and they're somehow mixed, conflated. And unfortunately, the word risk just really isn't very easily disambiguated, even within a lexical context, as I'm going to give you some examples. So what I'm going to try to cover today, not in this order or in particular order, I'll just weave together these different topics of the definitions of risk, some examples of risk scenarios. I'll develop a really crude rudimentary ontology of risk just for discussion purposes, and then try to validate this to make sure that we have an understanding of all the different notions of risk. So I'll try to establish that this ontology is adequate for the various definitions and for the disaster life cycle. And then I'll go into a little more detail in giving a mathematical theory of risk. So what are common definitions of risk? Well, if you go to the international standard, look in various sources, you see the definition is effect on uncertainty of objectives. And I think somebody needs to be unmuted. Seems to be muted. Robbie, can you take care of muting participants?
Okay, we are all, you are unmuted.
And everyone else should be muted.
Peers except me.
Okay, good.
I will make sure. No, there are a couple more. I will unmute them. I will unmute them.
Okay. So with this international standard, just effective uncertainty on objectives, there are, so implicit in this is that you can have both positive and negative effects. But if you look in the dictionary definition, like the OED, it clearly only includes negative effects for risk. It's possibility of loss, injury, or other adverse or unwelcome circumstance. So already we see a bit of an ambiguity here. Do we include positive effects? Consider this phrase. So this my first simple example. So you want to risk $1,000 on a venture. What is the risk in this simple phrase? Is it the amount, $1,000, that's at risk? Or is it the probability that the venture will not achieve the expected return? So two possibilities here. And it really matters. Suppose that the amount was $2,000 with the first interpretation, that $2,000, right, on the venture is twice as risky, right? Twice as much at risk. But with the second interpretation, the risk is the same. There's no difference in the probability of venture achieving the expected return, all right, assuming it's a pretty large venture. So the common definition is the second interpretation, but when people use this phrase commonly, it would seem that the first interpretation would be more intuitive. So already you can see a possibility of miscommunication. So let's start by giving a very initial rudimentary taxonomy for risk. We already have these two possibilities, amount that's at risk and the probability for the achieving objectives. And then a risk can have either a positive or a negative effect, right? That's independent of whether whether you have achieved your objectives. Is it going to be a positive effect or a negative effect? Okay, the term in risks for a positive effect is an upside risk, and a negative effect is called a downside risk. So as you can see now, we've ramified into three possibilities for what risk might mean. Furthermore, now mathematically, you could multiply the probability by the expected result. So we take two of these notions of risk, multiply the probability by the amount, and what you get is the expectation. Okay, that's a term from probability theory. It's average expected amount of that results from taking this risk. That's not really another notion of risk. It's just a way of combining these two notions of risk. Unfortunately, none of these interpretations of risk is actually the definition of risk in finance. So now we find there's yet another notion of risk. In finance, risk is not the probability, it's the variance. And this simple observation was sufficient for a Nobel Prize. Harry Markowitz won the Nobel Prize for making this observation and developing what became the foundation for the field of modern portfolio theory. Now, there are three interpretations that you can now give for risk as a variance. You could consider the two-sided variance, all right? That's upside and downside. For the risk, or you can consider just one of them, the downside risk or the upside risk. So it now ramifies into three possibilities for risk as variance, and this actually is significant. All right, you will get different answers depending on which of these interpretations of risk as variance you use. Now, you might say, well, what's it got to do with disasters? Well, the same techniques could be applied to other risks. And in particular, it seems to me it would be fruitful to start considering this other notion of risk from finance in the context of pandemics and other disasters. So now we add this to the taxonomy, and now you see the risk is now getting to be quite a large taxonomy of possibilities for risk. All right, so again, this is a very rudimentary taxonomy, ontology. Obviously, in the context of a particular case, one would expect one would get even more, would start linking the risk to your possible disasters, right? And having a much more sophisticated ontology. Oh, you've already got it. Something in the chat. What is meant by variance? Okay. By variance, I mean, when you have a probability distribution with various outcomes, the first moment is, of course, the expectation or the average. The second moment is the variance. The square root of the variance is the standard deviation. It's a measure of the spread of possible values that one can take for the probability distribution. All right, so that's kind of giving me the general definition, but let me give an example to illustrate this, so you can see very clearly why variance matters. So we'll take another example. This is insurance. Insurance is a shared risk. So an example would be an automobile accident insurance policy. With no insurance, a rare event could result in an unaffordable cost to the driver. So the variance with no insurance is very high. With insurance, on the other hand, the collection of all drivers will pay just the average cost of accidents, plus, of course, some administrative costs for managing the insurance. So what we've done is we switched from a high variance case where you have small probabilities of very serious consequences and, fairly high probability of essentially no consequence, to a case where everybody pays the average cost, but now the variance is low. So this should help explain, give a good answer to that question. What do I mean by variance? Just consider your automobile policy and what it does. Now, in general, reducing variance is going to have a cost, right? The various ways in which this cost is factored in. But clearly, it does have a cost. So now let's take a look at the various domain definitions of risk. I can go to the Wikipedia page and it gives a whole collection of examples of what it means in the various domains. And I use this as kind of a test to validate whether that taxonomy that I just developed is actually adequate for the notion of risk. So what I did is I looked through all of these. Business risk, for example, this is nearly the same as economic or financial risk, but it's actually a broader category because it can also include occupational safety risks, which are better defined in terms of probability. Then there's environmental risk. This is the downside probability definition. So it's the same as minimizing, it's defined to be minimizing the chance of a harmful environmental effect. What about health risk? This is an example of a downside probability definition. Definition is to minimize the chance of harmful health effects such as disease. Health insurance, on the other hand, that's a form of insurance, and we just saw that has a different meaning. Furthermore, healthcare is starting to recognize the need for improving the quality of life, in other words, upside risk, as well as minimizing diseases, in other words, downside risk. So healthcare is starting to be more general in terms of the different notions of risk. We have a question. Okay, yes, please put your questions in the chat room. And I guess I'll take a look at that right now.
Yeah, just a comment from Janet.
So Janet,
she's just giving us a link for the external chat room.
okay, precision medicine ontology, great. So that's Gary. So here is an example where an ontology has incorporated a notion of risk. So that's good. All right, so there are regulations for insurance companies. There are requirements that one have insurance. That's an interesting discussion on its own, whether you should require automobile insurance, whether you should require health insurance. That's a little outside the scope of what I'm going to talk about today, but it's definitely an interesting discussion on its own and definitely related to issues such as disaster. Perhaps later on, when I finish this talk, we might have a discussion in that direction. So getting back to this, a few more definitions of risk. Again, information technology risk, occupational risk, which is a safety risk. Project risk, interestingly, includes both downside and upside risks separately. Oops, meant to go back. There we go. You want to maximize the positive effects and minimize the negative effects for projects. So that explicitly includes both of these. And safety risk generally only includes downside. But of course, accident insurance is a different notion. And security risks are generally only considering downside. But what about the disaster life cycle? Now, risks occur all the way through the life cycle. So I'm going to highlight a few of these in a few slides. And I'm by no means handling all of the different parts of the life cycle, but I've sampled enough of them that I feel that the taxonomy that I developed is actually adequate. So determining potential disasters, here's of course a place where you definitely want to consider risks. And an interesting aspect of this is that some disasters have both positive and negative effects for the same event. I have a citation here, and of course this is pointed out to me by Gary. Thanks, Gary. Naturally occurring wildfires may have beneficial effects on native vegetation, animals, and ecosystems that have evolved with fire. So, so the notion of risk for environmental disasters is actually a little more complicated than just the downside risk. Another aspect of this life cycle of disasters is estimating probabilities and costs. And this is where the expectation of cost will be important. And presumably you could also start considering the variance. And there's the issue of mitigating. So you'd like to be able to reduce risks, but mitigating risks has a cost. There's a cost for mitigating the risks, and there's a cost for reducing variance. When the cost of mitigation exceeds the cost or the expected cost of a potential disaster, it would seem like the rational course of action is just take the risk without attempting to mitigate it. But when you think about it, it's only realistic if the affected entities can actually afford the cost. So you see, it's not so simple as simply taking a simple cost benefit analysis. Okay.
I will tell you about the various questions in the chat. We will go through them, Ken.
So we'll get through them in a moment. Okay.
Sure. Please take your time.
All right. Yeah. As I say, I'm not actually going to be covering some of these aspects, which I hope we get to in the discussion concerning reserves and regulations, which are very important. Then managing knowledge. Now, here's a different aspect. When you monitor a disaster, you need to manage the knowledge. And so what I'm proposing here is that we need a good ontology that considers all these notions of risk in your ontology, because it's useful for being unambiguous about what you mean when you say risk. Okay, so managing the knowledge requires disambiguating the notion of risk, and that should be in the ontology. So even ontologies that have these other, notions of risk have, like, the examples that I gave, ontologies for all of those domains should include the other notions of risk, because sometimes people do use them, and you must, you should be able to, you should include them in order to avoid miscommunication for monitoring and managing your disaster. Okay, so now I'll go into a little mathematics about risks. This is portfolio theory. Portfolio management requires two inputs, and presumably other examples of the use of risk as variance will also have these two inputs. One of them is the investment vehicles, stocks, bonds, funds, warrants, whatever. What investment vehicles are you going to be considering or allowing? And then there's the second input, which is the level of risk tolerance. How tolerant are you of risks? Now, the first step, all right, and this is where the first input is used, is to select the potential investment vehicles. So if you are in a, setting up an investment portfolio, you might have the constraint only invest in eco-friendly companies. So you have to do some investigation to see if a given company that claims to be eco-friendly really is eco-friendly, and so on. So there's some effort involved in selecting potential investment vehicles. But when you're done, you're going to have a set of potential investment vehicles, and each investment vehicle in practice is either acceptable or not. Typically, you don't have partially acceptable vehicles at the end of this step. Then the second step is to maximize the return of the portfolio subject to the risk tolerance. Okay, and here's where the mathematics comes in. So let R be the risk or return vector, return on investment or whatever, which consists of a random variable for each of your vehicles. Then W is a weight vector. So it something called a stochastic vector. It's the proportions of the total portfolio for each investment vehicle. Then your portfolio is the return of the portfolio as a whole, is given by this matrix product, W transpose R. It's also, it's essentially a dot product. Then you compute the expected return, right? And that's W transpose the expectation of the risk vector. Okay, so that's one calculation. And the other is the variance of your portfolio. And that's computed by this formula here, where you have the matrix product of the transpose of the weight times the covariance matrix of your random variables and then the weight vector. This gives you the variance of your expected return on the portfolio. Now, if you have a downside risk or upside risk, then you use a one-sided covariance matrix. Okay, now the idea of using a covariance matrix is interesting. Disasters can also be correlated. So if you have a number of disasters or different kinds of disaster that are related, you should probably also consider how they're correlated and compute a covariance matrix so that you're not you know, miscalculating what the actual variance is. And of course, as I mentioned before, this standard deviation is the square root of the variance. So now L is your maximum level of risk that can be tolerated in terms of variance. And now your objective is to maximize the expected return subject to the variance being bounded by L. Now, this is a well-known problem. It's called a quadratic programming problem. It's an optimization problem. And it turns out there's a whole lot of methods for solving quadratic programming problems. This is a popular area. These problems occur in a lot of contexts. And there's a lot of sources of freely available software for solving such a problem. Of course, it's also proprietary software. But what's interesting, there's also software that will determine the best portfolio for a specified level of risk tolerance and a selection of investment vehicles. I've used them, and they're freely available. And so anyone can be a financial manager. Okay, so for all of you now who have attended this talk, you are now qualified to be financial managers. You can collect the certificate for financial management on the way out from the classroom. Congratulations. Seriously, but now there are actually other techniques that have been developed for portfolio management. It's a popular area in economics. However, it turns out that every alternative technique actually improves one issue at the expense of other issues. Kind of like the classic problem of optimization, or theorem of optimization. It says there's no free lunch. In economics, it's more, it's called the, what is it? There's a term for this. It's the hypothesis that you cannot beat the market. So it's called the efficient market hypothesis. So it's roughly the same as the no free lunch. The other problem with using these more sophisticated and complicated portfolio management techniques is that the risk tolerance is seldom actually exactly known. You only know it roughly. So having a really precise, exact portfolio management technique would seem unnecessary. You don't know your inputs exactly anyway. So why start getting more complicated? So basically, what I'm saying is the basic portfolio management technique is good enough. So actually, you don't need to start getting into all these others. You're perfectly good as a financial management if you use the basic technique that I just mentioned. And those tools that are out there are really good. They set up all these fancy, colorful pie charts and graphs and tables. They produce that all automatically. Just put in your selection of investments that you're willing to, that you want to use. Put in your level of risk tolerance, and out all this comes. That's all there is to it, to financial management. And you don't even have to pay for the software. So the conclusion now is that there are many kinds of risk. And so it's important to be precise about what one means, in order to avoid miscommunication. So now I survey the different kinds of risk for different domains and different phases of the disaster life cycle. I developed a rudimentary taxonomy. All right, you really need to develop that thoroughly in order to have really adequate treatment of risk in a particular domain or for the disaster life cycle. And develop financial risk in more detail. The idea being that you might be able to use these techniques for other kinds of risks and other kinds of disasters, including the pandemics and environmental disasters. Okay. So, and thanks to Gary, who helped with this, and here are the citations.
Excellent.
Now let's
Excellent.
have a lively discussion where everyone can give some ideas to this.
Excellent, wonderful overview, and a lot of math implied in the presentation, but luckily not derived, so we could all understand. But some of us here present are experts in risk management. Obviously, Mike Bennett is among us. And obviously, he would object to certain terms, because once you say stochastic, you already imply probabilities and things of that sort. I have a lot of comments, but I'm going to defer them a little bit to give others an opportunity to get started on Q&A. I see that Todd's hand is up, and maybe others. So
Okay,
please, Todd, go ahead,
Mike
Todd.
was the first one who said to include positive outcomes as part of the definition of risk is to blur or outright ignore the distinction between risk and uncertainty. No, I'm saying that probability is just one notion of risk. I don't want to blur them. I want to make them distinct, distinguish them. And it's very important you don't ignore this distinction. So do you have anything more to add there, Michael?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yes.
So normally risk means there's some uncertainty, and normally risk means that the outcome is going to be bad. But if you say it could be a good outcome or a bad outcome, and then you're basically saying that there's some uncertainty, it might be a good outcome, it might be a bad outcome. So every time there's an uncertainty about an outcome, if you allow positive risks, then every outcome that's uncertain, you could call it a risk. I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I wouldn't choose to do that myself, and I don't have any control over how people use the term, but I just make that observation. Some definitions of risk say there must be uncertainty. So in other words, if you have a 100% chance of losing your money, then there's no risk. There's a certain outcome of losing your money.
Yeah, I agree with you. The probability is different for the positive and negative outcomes.
Right. Anyway,
Oh, absolutely.
Thank you.
So I guess that taxonomy that I gave was wrong. The expectation should be linked to the leaf nodes there, not to the probability.
Actually, what I liked a lot about your talk, I think it was very good, was to highlight the fact that when people talk about risk, they're really talking about a whole bunch of different things, and they're not consistent in their what they're talking about. But if you step up a little bit, I had an interesting experience several years ago. We were modeling risk for one of the major global investment banks. And we were at 3 hours in the meeting trying to define risk. And they thought they agreed with each other at one point. Somebody says, yes, here's what risk is, blah, 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 blah. And then someone else jumped in and says, yes, that's exactly right. And then they summarized their understanding of what the other person just said. But it was different. So after 3 hours, nobody agreed on anything. And then I said, well, let's see what we can agree on. And instead of trying to define risk per se, I rephrased the question and said, when we're talking about risk, what are we talking about? And in the language of a 4-year-old, here's what it is. A bad thing might happen. There's a degree of badness. There's some likelihood of it happening, and there's measures that you put into place to make it less likely. And pretty much anytime anybody's talking about risk, they're always talking about some combination of those 4 things. So suddenly, after arguing for 3 hours and realizing nobody's ever going to agree on what risk is, it was easy to agree that risk is an amalgamation of these 3 or 4 simple things.
Right. So we're using one word risk for a very, for all sorts of different things.
So we did build an ontology, and I won't get into it, but I'll just say one thing. Because risk is so ambiguous, the term, we very consciously did not put it in the ontology. And if we talk about a specific thing, we gave the class or the property a very specific meaning, so it became clear what we're talking about.
I see that 3 hands are up now. I'm sorry. I see 3 hands up. One is Todd, second is Mike, third is Gary. In that order, please. Kindly go ahead. Gary, sorry, Todd.
Todd, you're first.
Okay. Okay. Kenneth, there'll be a delay in the audio if you respond to me because of my satellite connection. But the first thing, this notion of risk, as you pointed out, is rather ambiguous. And as Michael just identified, it's nebulous to a lot of people, myself included. But the issue from an ontological perspective, I think, it's the risk of something or some things, plural. Correct? Yes or no?
Yes, that was, in fact, I mentioned that.
Well,
you have to link risk to something for it to be meaningful.
So,
yeah.
But regarding, again, from an ontological perspective, those things in the context of risk, is that about a change of state of those things? So, you know, if you have a car and I have an accident, I now change the state of the car. So can we say that risk is really about, or is related to, or about a change of state of something?
Yeah, in fact, when you, okay, I didn't show this, but I mean, how do you compute these variances and stuff? What you need is the past history. And so the risk is a very much dynamic process. Financial management is a dynamic process. You're constantly adjusting your mix of investments in response to events, because they
changes of state.
Changing your state, exactly.
Well, state of something, right? The things that you're investing in, whether it's a company or bonds or whatever. Yes.
So it's a risk of something, and it's a dynamic process.
Okay, but then in order to have a real ontology of risk, don't you really need an ontology of those things for which the risk is being computed about?
Exactly. I mean, what I gave is not a complete ontology. It's only kind of a micro theory you can join.
No. But in order to, but I guess what I'm saying, in order to have an appropriate or adequate ontology for risk, for, say, car insurance, don't you need to have an ontology about cars? At least, if you want to talk about the risk of having an accident for a car, in a car?
Yes. On the other hand, the mathematics is the same.
Oh, I don't care about that part. No, that's I'm not. That's
what
not
I'm
an
saying
issue.
is that there's a certain micro theory here that is purely abstract, that has to be specialized and customized and integrated into your ontology before it really is. Does that help?
Okay. Sort of.
I
Thank you, Kenneth. That's it.
I want next Mike, please. Mike Bennett.
Mike?
Hi everyone. Yeah, sorry I came late, but yeah, Mike Ushal just gave a good illustration of why you can't do ontology by starting with the words and trying to get people to agree with the words, because it's the concepts that matter. That's precisely why we're even doing ontology. And the concepts Gary mentioned in the chat, the risk hackathon that we did with Mike Dean and others back in 2014, we have this core model of something one could label risk, which is probability times impact. And impact then necessarily is the impact of some event on some goal. So you need an ontology of events. Events are just a change of state, as Todd just said. So the probability of some event which has an impact on some goal. And now again, this is again why we need ontology is, okay, we could label that probability times impact as risk, but impacts could be positive as well as negative. So there's kind of a more general term that simply doesn't have a name, which is that of which risk and opportunity are a kind, depending on whether the impact is negative or positive. And in finance, typically every risk that can impact one person's portfolio negatively will affect somebody else's portfolio positively. It's the same event with the same probability. And of course, again, to pick up another of Mike's points, if you've got a probability of 100%, then your risk is now an issue rather than a risk. So, the labels, once you get the ontology right, you put the labels where they most simply make sense. But it's, when you talk to insurance, they use the word risk to talk more about the impact, and then somewhere else they'll use the word risk to talk about the probability. But really, if you start with the model of probability times impact, and impact is of an event on a goal, then you can extend that into finance, into project management risk, into operational risk, financial risk, and so on.
Very good, Mike.
Very good.
I want to comment before, but I guess a quick one from Gary, but I have a lot related to what Mike just said. So Gary, you want to briefly go ahead?
I'll comment. I would prefer if Ken or Michael Usher or yourself have comments on what was just said, so we can keep this connected, and I'll comment later on my thing, okay?
All right. I just want to ask or maybe make some comments. When I think of risk, I think of two things. One is a pre-risk calculation, which is analytical models, estimates. So that's a risk analysis period. One is post events, and that is risk mitigation aspect. And these two might be linked to what you are trying to develop, Ken, at the upper level. But the main thing to say is that all kinds of actual data, probabilities, modeling, global Brownian motion, etc., GARCH, ARCH, various financial analytical techniques have been used in modeling for financial environment, including insurance or portfolio risks. The other side is when it actually happens, and UNDRR to a large extent deals with what do we do now that this has happened, the human scale of disaster or an event. And the third comment is about types of risks. Some were mentioned by Mike: operational, market, sovereign, exchange, catastrophe, environment. These are the types of risks that have been studied by various people and agencies. So I'll stop at this.
Anybody else have a comment on what Mike Bennett had said?
There is a comment that was put in the
Chat. I've
in the
been
Zoom
trying to
chat.
copy.
But you copied it?
I'm trying to copy all chat things.
Okay.
Not all are done. When I
Well-
copy, I may not have correctly
So,
give the
While you're
attribute.
working on that, could somebody?
Paulo, do you want to talk? I mean, you've given a number of.
Yeah, that's okay, Ken. I can talk a little bit because we've done some work on risk, and we have this ontology that also addresses value at the same time. So it's like two sides of the same coin, value and risk. So we have an ontology that includes value and risk, and many of the approaches that were mentioned there, I mean, some elements of what you mentioned about the whole ambiguity, these are things that we try to address by making a number of distinctions in the ontology and using risk mostly as an adjective to talk about risk assessment, risk event, and risk experience, instead of simply risk, which I think is a key, something what Michael also mentioned, key to avoid sometimes the polysemy, instead of becoming, avoiding a terminological war. What we've also done with services as well. So what is a service? Instead, let's talk about service delivery, let's talk about service relationship and things like this. So that's been very productive. So I just wanted to invite the colleagues to have a look at this work that we've done on ontology of risk and value, because I think it can be useful to build up on.
Yeah, definitely show us. Do you have
So I added some links. Yeah, I've added
the
two links on the, yeah.
That's great. Great.
Good. Thanks for the talk, by the way.
Okay, this is Gary. So if somebody could make me a co-host, I want to share one slide. And while you're doing that, I wanted just to get into the audio recording. But I had some comments in the chat, maybe that people can access later on, pointing out that things like precision medicine have definitions for risk at a high level. So there are some relevant things there. But if I could share my screen, I wanted to show something from Shirley Steffen's
Yeah, go ahead. You can
work.
share.
Go ahead, go ahead.
Okay, let me see if I can do that now and see if it, I just wanted to show what, for at least for some people, work. There, you might be able to see it now. I just wanted to show this. Yeah, so this is one of her submodules. You know, she was working with and has been working with the UNDRR on risk and resilience and so forth. And so you see, in this model, risk is related to a hazardous situation, a negative part in terms of exposure and the magnitude of that. And then there are elements of risk which relate to the vulnerability or the resilience of particular elements. And of course, there are modules that even go down below that. So I just wanted to point out that there are, as was said before, people are working on some models, ontologies that involve some of these things for particular things. In this case, it's disasters from based on the UNDRR. And hopefully we'll be able to get Shirley to present it sometime in the future. I've tried several times to get a hold of her, but haven't succeeded at this point. And but hope lingers.
Yeah, Gary, I actually looked at that when I was developing
Yes.
my presentation, and it was a little too detailed for me to present. And anyway, the thing that I kind of missed, that seems to be missing in that, is correlations. You know, this whole idea that different events, different disasters can be correlated with each other. That doesn't necessarily mean they cause each other.
Yeah.
And so that should be part of the ontology as well.
Well, you know, in past summits and related articles from that, there's this idea of incremental refinement of ontology. So I like the possibility of having patterns that have some general coverage, but then it could be instantiated and over time can be expanded, so that in Shirley's case, you know, we're looking at a second or third order submodule, which in turn can also be expanded. And then you get eventually down to the very specific domain of what are you talking about? You know, you're in the environment, not in finance, but in the environment, what are you talking about? Are you talking about vulnerability of human structures, or you're talking about the vulnerability of forests and things of that nature? So I believe that over time, these things can be refined and extended, but we have to start with something that has a good structure to begin with.
Absolutely.
Good, good, Gary. Good point.
Yeah, I mean, this gets into your paper on the incremental development
Semantics,
of
yeah.
ontologies, right?
Incremental semantics, yes.
Incremental semantics. And that's, by the way, that has appeared now in the Journal of the Washington Academy of Sciences. I actually have the issue right here.
Okay, now we can cite it. Very good.
It's right there. If you send me an email, I can give you more detail about the thing. This is a really thick, our special issue is one of the thickest issues that they ever had. So,
you know, if we do have time in our schedule, maybe Gerald would actually be able to present to us in more detail on that work.
yeah,
There seems to be some interest in that. So, you know, there might be holes in our schedule that that maybe you could fulfill.
I can prepare for the future. Yeah, sure.
Oh, we'll look
yeah,
into that.
we'd love to have you.
Very good.
Sure.
Right.
Who is speaking? Who is speaking so I can capture in the chat?
It was me.
Paulo?
How do you spell your first name?
So it's Joao.
How do
Never
you
mind
say
how
it?
you would pronounce it. João. It's a Portuguese name.
How is that pronounced?
Oh,
João.
João.
Yes, that's very good, Ken. That's
Okay.
remarkably good.
It shows you the transliteration problem.
Never mind the tilde.
Okay, great. So
Thank you. What would be the topic if you speak to us?
I guess I could also invite, Giancarlo to join me, and we could talk about, and Tiago with the co-authors on this, and we could talk about the common ontology of value and risk. I think it would be interesting and an application of it.
Any
Yeah.
connection with the disasters?
Yes, because disasters would be loss events that are part of this overall risk experience. So yes, disaster would be some kind of events that that can play this role in the risk experience.
Do you have a use case?
The work not related to disasters, because what we used this ontology for was about trying to revise the Archimate language which had an extension for risk modeling. So people doing risk management would use Archimate for expressing their risk models, and we revised that based on Cover. And there was also some examples from motivated us from a perspective of the finance industry, but not applied directly to disasters. But certainly applicable in the same way that Ken discussed today.
John, Paulo, the Archimedes was developed, Archimate was developed for enterprise architecture primarily, and even towards TOGAF and Zachman frameworks early enough, and then applied into financial regime as well, is it?
Absolutely.
okay, is there any other Gary or
Am I audible? Am I audible?
Gary's hand is still up. Do you have
Yes.
something else to say, Gary?
Gary has spoken, didn't bring his hand down, but
I did now.
said, were you able to listen to what I was saying? Luan, are you able to listen to me, or is my voice
Yeah,
gone?
we can hear you.
Okay.
Okay, so
there is a concept, Ken, in risk, when you estimate the amount of losses. It is called LGD, loss given default. If some party or a collection or cohort or collective debt, obligations, documents collectively have resulted in a loss, then the formula for calculating that loss given default using risk modeling is LGD. It's very extensively used by financial people, even for environmental and other disasters. So maybe Mike or others want to comment on that aspect of risk. I wonder.
Yeah, loss given default is an impact. So it's just a child of impact. With that core model of probability times impact, you can specialize impact. And
Yes.
loss given default is a really clean example of that.
And so that comes in the mitigation aspect of the risk, the post-event mostly, although you can model it to see various scenarios of if this event happens like this or like that. But actually it is based on data of actual disasters, often, not always. Thank you, Mike.
So I briefly mentioned another aspect of risk, which is regulations.
Yes, and
I'm sure that
yeah.
Mike would have a lot to say about that.
Oh, yes, for
Mike?
sure. But I said two things, insurance and the other financial regulations are opposite of each other in terms of what the insuring company or the financial companies have to have the amount of reserves to meet the eventuality. So the financial risk people need larger reserves compared to insurance companies. That's why if you remember in 2008 disaster, market folded and the insurance company said we cannot meet. Or for Katrina, the insurance companies threw up their hands and Fed said to enter the fray to bail them out. So there is a limit to the amount of reserves and amount of disaster capacity of handling.
Yeah. But there's this whole issue of regulation.
Yeah, that's related to regulation because they did not ask them to hold more reserves. So when actual catastrophe happened, their reserves were not enough to
Mhm.
meet the demand of the claims.
Mm.
So they
Yeah, I
lost.
think Ravi's covered the regulation thing quite nicely. That's right. There are things you have to do. There's lots of other regulations. I'm not really familiar with all of them, but one thing to keep in mind is the impact. You're defining the impact of something that hasn't happened. So by definition, you can't measure it. So do you do it by actuarial figures where the impact is based on things that have happened in the past, or do you do it by some other kind of models? And in finance, we have various ways of modeling both reduction and increase in money. So opportunity and loss, or gain and loss. If something's very liquid market, you can use the market to determine the value of something and therefore the loss given default. But if it's not a very liquid market, perhaps you use models. And so then there's various regulations about what sort of modeling you can use in different ways. I'm not familiar with the details, but those are all, to talk about something that hasn't happened, there may or may not be regulations about how you can define that.
Well, see, now think about this
Excellent.
in terms of other domains like environment. What regulations should one have regarding the environment? That's a big issue nowadays.
Yes, excellent. Yes.
What impact do various regulations have? What regulations should there be? What are the objectives you're trying to achieve with the environment? That's a really complicated issue and very controversial. So risk, disasters, and regulations, they're all related to each other, and really need to disambiguate all the different terms that we're using. And it would seem to me that the ontologies that are ontologies are the way to go for dealing with this problem of miscommunication. Well, actually, we've run out of time.
Well, unless there are pressing questions.
Can I say one thing? I just put it in.
Oh,
the chat.
yes, Janet,
Janet,
please.
great.
The risk of a change of state in some asset that is evaluated by some party, those are all necessary. But then the necessary concepts, what would distinguish a true disaster or a social disaster from a personal disaster is the scale. And so that's a complicating factor that it's in there. I'm sure it's considered in Shirley's work and other work, but so we have a spectrum here from personal disasters to what we consider a true disaster, which has a large scale impact on infrastructure or
population,
that kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly. And
You raise good point.
look at the COVID-19 pandemic. It's global, but then the experience of the pandemic was different from one country to the next, from one region within the country to the next, from one person to the next. So there are just so many different scales for the COVID-19 disaster.
There's one thing I forgot to mention on, you asked about regulation.
Yes.
I mentioned that impact is by definition an impact on some goal. But one thing that really challenges the model is when you have systemic risk, where the goal is simply the system not collapsing. And one of the challenges that came out of the 2008 crisis and got the regulators very busy with, like, the Office of Financial Research in the US and so on, is that the systemic risk emerges from the whole system and isn't the sum of all the risks of individual banks. So if you get every bank to report their own risk, you're missing systemic risk. So the regulators had to think about what are the things we need to know about pieces of the system that could result in emergent systemic risks, such as the 2008 crisis. So Ken, that's probably, I was wondering why you were asking about regulation. That was probably what you're thinking of, and I completely forgot about it.
Well, yeah,
Excellent.
when you look at these different scales and different types of risk, you shouldn't think of them independently because they are correlated. And in that financial crisis in, what was it, 2008, yeah, there was this definite risk that because of the correlations among all the different financial institutions, that you could have a general collapse.
I just add for you and Ken, you and Mike, just a quick one is that when we are done with COVID cost and impact estimates, not only life loss would be very paramount, but will also be the big, huge financial overturn of the global economy, in my opinion, when we are done with it.
Mhm.
So there'd be good models needed to deal with something like COVID is what I was trying to say, Ken, based
Yes,
on what Mike said.
absolutely. So with that, I think we should.
Yeah, I want to thank Dr. Ken Baclawski, Professor Ken Baclawski, and our leader in this forum. We want to thank you for taking really afresh, not having worked a long time on risks of different types, yet you brought us some good overview and understanding of the whole topic, for which we thank you. And we request that participants continue to come in and contribute more and more to our talks as they did today. So we want to thank everybody, including Ken. Thanks.
Well,
I second
thanks,
that.
all of you.
It was very nice talk, and Ken, it was really great of you to come in to give this today.